Let's review a little bit what we saw until now. Basically, the beginning of the paragraph Layachfor is about Nizkei Shchenim, preventing damages from occurring between neighbors. And two of the key points we saw so far is that there's two types of damages. There is unidirectional damages where one thing damages the other. We had three examples we saw previously, actually four examples. One is planting a tree next to a swimming pool in the contemporary context, where the roots of the tree will damage the pool. The other one was putting flax water next to vegetables, putting leek next to onions, and putting mustard next to honeybees. And in all these cases, the damage goes one direction. The tree damages the pool. The mustard damages the bees. What happens is that the mustard is very sharp. The bees bite the mustard. They get they need to cover the sharpness in their mouth. So they start eating their own honey. So the beekeeper is obviously not happy. And the flax water destroys the vegetables. It's like acidic or corrosive or something like that. And it doesn't let the vegetables grow well. Okay, and the key idea is that in all these things, we have a major debate between the rabbis and Rabbi Yossi. Right? The rabbis say, Al hamazik lahachik etatzmai. It's the one causing the damage that he has to distance himself. And Rabbi Yossi says, no, it's al hanizik lahachik etatzmai. It's the victim's responsibility to distance himself. In these cases, there's a clear victim and there's a clear aggressor. The aggressor suffers no consequence for what he did, right? The guy who dumps the wastewater from the flax, he doesn't care what happens to the wastewater. It doesn't impact him at all. It only impacts his friend. The fact his friend plants tomatoes doesn't impact him. Okay, so that's the major debate between Rabban and Rabbi Yossi. Now, like we pointed out, Rabbi Yossi will agree, and we'll get to it later in the parak. Rabbi Yossi will agree by what's called girei delay. That means that if you stand at the edge of your property and start shooting arrows into your friend's property, flaming arrows, just to, light his stuff on fire. Obviously liable.
19A, top.
What was that? 19A, top of the page. And therefore, Rabbi Yossi would agree that in any scenario where the mazik is directly damaging the nizik, the aggressor is directly damaging the victim, it's the aggressor's responsibility to move away. Not something that's indirect and occurs after a very long time. Okay. The other point we had, which was another scenario, which is the first few scenarios in the parak, is the scenario of a mutual damage. For example, if I want to build a pit next to my property and you want to build a pit next to the property line, then both pits will damage each other. They undermine the foundation of the pits, and then we had a debate between Abai and Rava whether or not you're allowed to place initially a pit at the property line, so that will cause your friend to put a distance, more of a distance than if you had distanced yourself from the property line initially. And that was Machlokes between Abai and Rav. Okay, let's begin top of the page. You test some Aleph Len Nivrachas HaKayvsen. Okay, so Nivrachas HaKayvsen basically is when there was before the washing machine days, there was a pit where the clothes would sit. They would soak in a detergent. We'll see detergent, Rashi says, was made out of the dung of dogs, and you take dog dung and you put it in the pit, would mix it with water, and the clothing would sit there for a few days, and then once it's soaked, then you'd move into a different pit where you would wash it off. Okay, the names of these pits, one's called a mechamtzen, and one's called a nedayin. The mechamtzen is where you allow it to soak. The nedayin is where you wash it. Now, which one is more problematic? The one where you wash it, because it makes a big mess. So the Mishnah says the pit of a washer has to be 3 tefachim away. That's only the soaking pit. The washing pit, the pit that's used for rinsing, Dalet amitz, it's 4 amitz, 6 feet. But we learned that it's 3 tefachim in the Mishnah. Tanya the Brisa also seems to support this because it says that the washer has to move 4 amas. But what about the fact that the Mishnah says 3 tefachim? Seems to be a contradiction. It must be like Rav Nachman. It depends which pit we're talking about. The soaking pit is 3 tfachim. The washing pit is 4 amos. Some ask it as a question. The Mishnah says 3 tfachim. The Brisa says 4 amos. One is from the mechamtzin, that's the soaking pit. Kamen and a dayan, the washing pit, you need much further 4 amos. They had an amended text of the Mishnah, which the Mishnah specifically mentioned. The type of washing pit we're referring to is the soaking pit. Okay, so the Mishnah says you have to move 3 tfachim and you have to put plaster. The question is it an and or is it an or? And there are a few different versions of the Gemara here. I'll explain the Gemara according to Rashi's version. Is the Mishnah 3 tfachim and plaster, or it's 3 tfachim or plaster? So the Gemara says, Pshita devisad b'sitnan. Obviously, it must be and plaster, both distance and plaster. Why? The oisad b'sitnan, that it's either or. Why isn't it listed together with the second line of the Mishnah? Okay, so let's explain. The Mishnah was categorized into 3 different sections. The first section of the Mishnah was scenarios of moving pits, keeping pits away from each other. The second line of the Mishnah was keeping things that produce heat away from each other, heat away from the wall. Yeah. So now, in the second scenario, it's clear that it's either 3 tfachim or plaster. Meaning you want to put, you want to have big rocks next to the wall. You want to put a pile of sand next to the wall. That's fine. You have to move 3 tfachim or put on plaster. So now, if the first part of the Mishnah was the same result, 3 tfachim or plaster, why didn't it put it as one large section? Whether the damage is to a pit or whether the damage is to a wall, it's 3 tfachim or plaster. Why does the Mishnah listed as 2 separate entries? It must be that there's 2 different results. If you're trying to distance pits from each other, subterranean structures, so then it's 3 tfachim and plaster. If you're trying to distance things that produce heat, like sand and rocks and other things, then it's 3 tfachim or plaster. And that's why the Mishnah can't combine them into one entry, because the result is 2 different things. What you need to do, what you need to be accomplished is 2 separate things. Okay. So the Gemara says it's not really such a good proof, because the reason why they're separated is because they're 2 different categories of damage. Maybe the reason why they're listed as separate entries is because they're different types of damages. Reisha, the first part of the Mishnah, is the Misuna. The first part of the Mishnah is the hezek of moisture. Things that are moist, that they damage each other because of their wetness, their moisture. Seifa hezek the havlo. The second line is the damage of heat. So the reason, it could be that the result is actually the same, but the reason why they're divided into 2 categories is because they're 2 different types of damages. That's not a good proof. Toshma, let's examine this. Rabbi Yehudah says, Selah Babi Yadayim. We spoke about Selah Babi Yadayim yesterday. Selah Babi Yadayim is a rock that's so soft, it's like a very soft ground. It crumbles in your hands. Okay, in that case, it's clear that you need to move, each one of them has to move 3 tfachim, 6 in total, and they need to put on plaster. Okay, so 1 second. Time of the Babi Yadayim. The reason here is because it's very fragile earth, because it comes apart very easily. So because the earth is so soft, that's why we need to make additional protections and demand plaster. That makes sense. Haloi Babi Yadayim, but if the earth wasn't so soft and brittle, saloi, then you would not need to put on plaster. So this seems to indicate the Mishnah is or. Either in a regular earth, it would be 6 tvachim or plaster. Yeah? In other words, the Mishnah says that this unique circumstance of this very soft earth requires both distance and plaster. The presumption of that is that where the earth wasn't so soft, you would not require both. It would be either or. Samar says, no. The truth of the matter is that there's no difference between where the earth is extremely soft or where the earth is not extremely soft. It's exactly the same thing. You need to do the 6 tefachim plus the plaster and plaster. Okay, so now what's unique about Babi Yadayim? What's unique about this very soft soil? So the answer is Babi Yadayim. I would think that if the soil is very brittle and soft, then it could be that the 6 tefachim in the plaster isn't even enough. You need to have much more distance or much more plaster. So that's what the Mishnah says. No. The soft earth has the same rule potentially as even regular firm earth. So we haven't resolved the question. Remains a question whether the first line of the Mishnah is plaster and earth, plaster and distance, or plaster or distance.
I'm assuming that you need the plaster because it's soft earth and the water will seep easier that way.
Probably, yeah. It's fair. It's a fair presumption. There may also be a component that it would retain the height, it would retain the wall better as well. So it would be the structural integrity of the pit, not just besides for the moisture.
We're talking from the wall.
The wall of the pit, which is itself 3 tefachim. It's 6 tefachim total. Yeah, that was. If you go back to when you go back to see yesterday's daf, you'll see that right at the beginning. That's the first discussion. Okay, so the next list of categories is things that produce heat. So let's just try to give a little bit of introduction here. We'll start over the question from Mishnah in Mishnah Masechta Shabbos. Okay, on Shabbos there is a concern. There was a we're not allowed to cook on Shabbos. However, there's been a strong Jewish tradition, very strong Jewish tradition, to have hot foods specifically. Now, how do we ensure that the food stays hot over Shabbos? Like today, we have crockpots with timers and all sorts of contraptions. We have grids that supply electric constantly or gas constantly. It's not such a problem. But before the grid, how did you ensure you had hot soup Friday night or Shabbos morning? So there's a few different methods you could use. One is you can overload your oven, put in a lot of wood so it will burn it for a long time. It's a simple solution. Another one is that you can insulate it very well. You had a special box, you filled it with insulating materials, you covered the box completely with insulating materials, and then it would insulate for a very long time. Equivalent to the modern day of what we call cooler. Right, but the cooler was filled like today. We fill coolers typically with ice cubes, right? But the pizza delivery guys, right? Same idea. Pizza delivery guy has they have a special thing. It's filled with heat insulation, right, to make sure that the pizza that comes delivered to you warm. Okay, so now there's a concern here. So typically, an insulating material is not an active substance, right? It's not a substance that produces heat, but it could be. You could insulate with remets, that's a type of coal. The concern with using remets is that when you move around the remets, you could be creating fire, which is forbidden to do on Shabbos. So it could be even coals that are cool. So they're not actively on flames, but they're still very hot. So they couldn't produce a fire. Okay. And therefore, the rabbis made a decree, and they said that things that retain heat very well, or that they sort of add heat, are forbidden to make this insulating heat cooler box. It's not a cooler box. What do they call these things today? What do they call a Yeti? It's called a cooler, right? It's called a cooler. It's ice boxes. You can't fill your ice box with certain types of insulating materials, and these are materials that hold heat very, very well. Some of these things we use today, we know that they hold heat. Some of them we don't quite use today, but apparently they work as well. So b'met taimnin, what can you do hatmana with? B'met ein taimnin, what can't you do hatmana? Hatmana again is insulating. Hatmana is putting your pot in the cooler and filling it with an insulating material, and then closing the box. So they didn't have a cooler box; they had a different type of box, but it's the same idea. Okay, loy begefes, you can't use gefes. So gefes is the byproduct of olive oil production. So you squeeze out all the oil, you get this dry biomass, and that apparently would either hold or add heat. I'm not exactly sure. I'm not familiar with how it works or what it is.
Like a compost heat.
Like a compost heat. Okay. V'loy bezevel, similar ideas with dung. Again, I'm not familiar. V'loy bemelach. Melach is known to have very good heat retention properties, and when it's very hot, it holds heat for a very long time. V'loy besid, plaster cures with heat, so it actually adds heat. V'loy bechol, not with sand, bein lachem and yeveshim, whether the sand is moist or hot. Okay, now the problem is our Mishnah adds one. Our Mishnah adds rocks. Rocks are also known to have this property, right? If you have the vegetable people will often put rock walls next to their vegetable patches because they hold heat for a very, very long time, and this way they radiate heat after the sun has already set when the temperatures have cooled. This is a trick. When you plant tomatoes, especially in Oregon, we don't get hot temperatures here. I know you're just here for the past week, then it's crazy hot.
Not like it is.
We don't get hot temperatures. Tomatoes don't.
Touch our wall.
Yeah. Okay, so tomatoes don't grow very well here. So in order to do that, if you plant it next to a stone wall, so your tomatoes heat much better because the stone wall retains heat very, very well. Okay, and the same thing is true with sand. Now, our Mishnah adds stones, and the Mishnah of Hatmana adds sand. So the question sort of is, well, our Mishnah and the Mishnah of Hatmana are the same idea. These things, they create tremendous amounts of heat, and you don't want to damage a brittle cement wall. So which is it? In other words, these items are problematic because they create enormous amounts of heat, and they'll either damage the wall or are forbidden on Shabbos. So if all these items are problematic, then why doesn't the Mishnah of Atmana add rocks, and why doesn't our Mishnah add sand? Because the other items are all the same: the dung, the plaster, and the byproduct, the olive biomass. So why is it that our Mishnah adds rocks and that Mishnah adds sand? So typically people don't insulate with rocks. Sounds pretty reasonable. Maybe before they had those rocks you buy in the bags, like in Home Depot. It was pretty easy, but I guess they didn't have a uniform size. It's very difficult to insulate with rocks. So Abai says, do people do hatmana? Do they insulate with gizet tzemer? Gizet tzemer is like tufts of wool straight from the animal. So you have a sheep, you shear it. Those things that come off are called gizet. Gizet tzemer. They're these tufts of wool. These are strips of purple. Okay, the Tanya, and yet the Bryce discusses these things. Time to begizet tzemer, tzipet tzemer. Tzipet tzemer is a more refined byproduct. So you have these tufts of wool, right? You try to put them together and start combing them, and eventually spin them into threads. So once you comb them, you comb off, some of the stuff just comes off. It's a byproduct. That stuff is called tzipet tzemer. L'shein shalgaman is sort of byproducts of materials. So you were sewing material together, and you ended up with cutting up some strips of material. Those are l'shein shalgaman. Ubemuchen. 1 second here. Yeah, mukin is like the stuff that comes off of clothing. The pills, yeah. Stuff that comes off of clothing, you sort of comb it off. So all these things, and you can't move them. Okay, all these things are problematic because of muktzah. Now, meaning you can do the hatmana, but you can't move it. So you just lift the pot out, but you can't move around the pot. So you have a cooler filled with wool, tufts of wool. So you lift the pot straight out, or you have to tilt it in a way that you don't actually move with your hands the muktzah. These items, regardless, these strips of clothing wouldn't seem to be the first item that a person would use for insulation, but yet the Mishnah discusses it anyway. So that's not an argument. The fact that a person usually doesn't use rocks wouldn't be an obstacle for the Mishnah to discuss it, because the Mishnah discusses all sorts of things that are used that could be used but aren't used. So Abaya says Yagid Olav Rei. His friend will tell him, meaning each Mishnah tells you the other Mishnah. So our Mishnah tells you to add rocks, and that Mishnah tells you to add sand. And the truth is that they both apply to each other. Amalei Rava, so Rava wasn't impressed. He said, "Iyagad olav rei." If you tell me that, lisnina lekula b'chadav, listi chadim beidach. So one of the Mishnayos should have the entire list. The other Mishnah should just have one item of the list, and we'll say that Mishnah teaches us to either do it here or do it there. One of the Mishnahs should be complete. The other Mishnah just chooses one entry. And I would say, Yagad olav rei, its friend tells it that it's not just that plaster that causes heat, but it's also gefes and zevel and chol and slum. Al-Amar Rava says, Hasam hainu taimed like Tani Slum. The reason why the Mishnah in Bamet Taimim on Shabbos does not mention rocks, Mishtum de Mishtachila Kedera, because it causes rust. Okay, another version of Rashi is also because it breaks the pots. So that's why rocks weren't used for hatmana. So sand has this unique property that when it's hot, it retains its heat very well, but also when it's cold, doesn't heat up for a very long time. You'd think that that's sort of obvious, right? Everything that insulates well is typically like that. Rocks are like that too. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what to. 1 second. I would guess what I would have to presume here is that the properties of it are at the extremes, meaning when you're talking about like really hot temperatures, in 150 degrees or 200 degrees or so, then it works exceptionally well as retaining heat. But it wouldn't work so well in the intermediate ranges, meaning in normal temperatures, which outdoor temperatures don't get that hot. So I presume maybe the article is a better interpretation. I'm not sure. Okay. Check the article. See what they.
I'm assuming it's a molecular exposure thing. Each different transferring electrons back and forth.
Yeah, this seems to imply. Yeah, they explain my explanation. Basically, that it's only when you have this exceptional heat that it has good insulation properties. When you have normal temperatures, it's not an effective retainer of heat. Okay, so the Gemara says Vatani Ravaisha Chol. Okay, so what's that? So according to Rava, you're allowed to put sand right adjacent to this cement wall. So Gemara says it's just one problem. Rav Aisha in the Tosefta does add sand. So the Tosefta is sort of Rav Aisha expanded on Rebbe's Mishnayos and wrote a version called Tosefta. Tosefta is printed in the back of the Gemara. So he does add sand in his version. 1 second, but you're telling me that's not an effective insulator. So Gemara says no. Hasavim Masuna. We're talking about a moist sand, and the problem is not because of heat, but because of moisture. So the Gemara says, "Tani do nami listening but looking b'masuna." So then, why our Mishnah also lists things that damage moisture? Why isn't sand listed? The Gemara says, "Atanale amas hamayim." The Mishnah already gives an example. Amas hamayim is a stream. That's moisture problems. So the Gemara says, So the Gemara says that, okay, so in other words, because the Mishnah mentioned the stream, I know all sorts of moisture damages, and it would also be prohibited to put a moist sand against the brittle cement wall. So Gemara says, well, that's not a good response. Why? Because the Mishnah doesn't give just one example of moisture, it gives 2 examples of moisture. One is a stream, but the other is a cistern for washing, right? We said the soaking pit for the clothes washing was also problematic because of moisture. So the Mishnah gives 2 examples. Well, it can give a 3rd example, moist sand. That of Rav Aisha, the one that's given in Tosefta. It says both. It says a stream and a washing pit, the soaking one. So the Gemara says it needed to give 2 examples. The pit for the clothes washer is only gonna be used as long as the guy is washing clothes, whereas it's presumed that a stream will be built or will be flowing for eternity. So therefore, it has much more of a permanence. It could be that the pit is actually more problematic because it's soaking. So there's always moisture sitting there. Whereas an Amasamayim that flows, because it's flowing, maybe it would do less damage. So that's why the Mishnah need to give both examples. But once we have both examples, then we would include also a very moist sand could also cause damage to the walls.
Stream has its path where the water's going to flow, whereas something that's in the dam, it's pressure of the water.
Right. Okay. Fine. Now we get to the third category of the Mishnah. So again, the first category of the Mishnah was moisture. The second category of the Mishnah was heat. And now we have a number of different problems, things that you shouldn't do next to the other guy's fence. And two of them are don't plant vegetables and don't plow. Okay, what's the problem? They're both superfluous, right? If you're planting the vegetables, obviously you plowed, and if you plowed, obviously you're planting the vegetables. So what do you need both? How are you planting the vegetables if you didn't plow? It should be prohibited because you plowed already. So what's the answer? He dug it with a shovel. He didn't actually use a plow. So even if he did like a small vegetable patch, it wasn't his whole field, so he didn't use a plow, still would be prohibited. You plowed it. 1 second. Well, what's the purpose of the plowing? Because you're going to plant vegetables. Vegetables itself are prohibited. So why do you need a separate reason for the plowing? It would be prohibited because of the vegetables. So the Gemara says, we're talking about a guy who plows around the trees. It sort of aerates the soil better, and it allows the fertilizer to be dug in. So and they're not planting any vegetables there. So therefore, and that would also be prohibited on its own. So the Gemara says, "V'tebik le mishum maya." We have another problem here. The vegetables need to be watered, and you can't pour water next to the fence. Like we'll see. We'll talk about urinating at the fence. We'll get to it, but you can't pour water next to the fence. So if you have vegetables, you can't water them. So that the reason why vegetables are prohibited is because they can't be watered. The Gemara says, where the Mishnah the author lived in Israel, where these items didn't need to be watered. The natural rainwater was sufficient for them to grow. They didn't have to be watered. They didn't require additional water. So the Gemara asks, "Lememra, do you mean to say this roim with stodim kamishtarshim that zrom? These are vegetables. Their roots grow sideways, and therefore their roots are going to damage the wall. They're planting the vegetables next to the wall. But now we learned Okay, so we spoke about in the past a little bit about kloy hakerem. Just very briefly, there's a type of grafting which is planting things next to a vineyard. Now, this should not be confused that this has anything to do with the fact that there's some sort of cross-pollination or crossover among the roots. The reason why this has nothing to do with it, because if there's a wall, you can go right up to the wall. Not only that, even if there's no wall, let's say one property, the property with the vegetables, is pointed, right? It's a pointed property. It's like a diamond shape, and it juts right into the vineyard. No problem, because it's distinct. The key problem is that it should be mixed together. If it's pointed, they're clearly not mixed together, then it's permitted. Now, this is important to understand that this is only with a legal vineyard. What's a legal vineyard? A legal vineyard is comprised of 5 vines, 2 against 2, so a square of 4, and 1 tail. So there's one additional vine that's adjacent to the 4x4. So it's equidistant. So it's in the middle, basically. So you have 2x2, and then one in the middle. An additional one. That's 5. Okay. If you have a legal vineyard, 5 vines, then you're required to distance a large 4 amas from the vineyard. If you don't have a legal vineyard, then the distance required to distance your tomatoes from the vine is much smaller. So I think it's 6 tefachim, maybe something like that. It's a very short distance. Okay, regardless, one of the ways to grow vines is that the way vines work is that they grow what they call the gardeners, they call them runners. I don't know what the technical definition is, but basically you can bury a piece of a vine, and then a new vine will grow out of the ground. So this is what a guy did. Hamavrach hasegefen ba'aretz. Here the article will have a nice picture there of exactly how to do it. Okay, so you have one vine here. You made a runner to the next vine that you want to grow here. You cannot grow vegetables within a small radius of each vine, plus where the runner was put on the ground. But you could put immediately adjacent to it. So you have one here in the middle, put right on top and right on bottom. That's fine. Why? Presumably because the roots don't travel. The roots go straight down. They don't travel at all.
What does it mean on Gava upper shlosh tefachim?
Meaning, so the runner is less than 3 tefachim deep. So you took a vine, you buried it. If you buried it more than 3 tefachim deep, you would be allowed to plant vegetables right on top of it. But if it was less than 3 tefachim, to create this new vine adjacent to it, then you would not be able to plant immediately on top of it.
Took the whole vine and submerged it.
So the vine grows multiple branches. So he took a very long branch. He buried, let's say he buried a lot of it. He just dug a small hole, less 10 inches deep. I'm sorry, 6 inches deep, and then he left some of it coming out of the ground at a distance. There's one here and one here, and this supposedly what's supposed to happen is that this thing is supposed to develop roots, and this will turn into a new vine. So right now it's just a branch. Eventually, it will turn into its own vine. So along the runner line, you can't plant. You can't put vegetables on top of it. The Tanya law, you could put immediately adjacent to it. Elach for elach. As long as you're not directly on top of the runner, you're fine. Okay, clearly then, the roots are not traveling. That's why you can plant immediately adjacent to the runner. So, Amar of Chogom, B'Shem of Yaisim, the reason here is that it doesn't have to do with the roots necessarily traveling, even if the roots don't travel. If you undermine the soil that's immediately adjacent to a wall, that's undermining the wall itself. So therefore, that also would make it problematic. You don't need the roots to travel underneath the wall to make it problematic. As long as they undermine the soil immediately adjacent to the wall, that also damages the wall. Okay. One has to distance himself 3 tefachim to urinate. I'm using the word urinate here, but we'll say that might not be the precise word to be used. So let's see. A person is allowed to urinate immediately adjacent to his friend's wall. How do we know? This is a punishment. The verse here speaks in negative terms. I will cut down la'achav, mashtem b'kir. The family of Achav will be cut down. This is a euphemism for males. Anyone who urinates against a wall. It's referring to all the males of Achav's family will be killed. The Otzer v'Ozer b'Yisrael, they'll be removed from the Jewish people. Okay. Okay. Now, the fact that the euphemism is that they urinate against the wall indicates to us that it would be permitted to urinate against the wall. Right? This verse obviously is not this verse is a criticism of the family of Achav. It's prophesying their destruction, but the euphemism that's used indicates that is permitted behavior.
That wasn't the lean mode. If they wouldn't use such a
terminology, exactly. If it wasn't permitted, yeah. Okay, we'll soon see that there might be another definition. We'll get to it. Okay. What do you mean? How is it permitted? How is it that the euphemism used is those that urinate against the wall when it's not permitted to urinate against the wall? You have to move away 3 tefachim. So the Gemara says, Hasan b'shayfchim. The Mishnah is referring to a chamber pot. So it is permitted to urinate against the wall. But if you have a chamber pot that's filled, you can't pour it against the wall. Okay. It's like in Oregon, we all know what chamber toilets are, the trailheads, they will have chamber pots. And, there's chamber toilets. Okay. Tashma lo yishmech adam mayim b'tzad kaisa shachaveri. Lo yatal adam mayim b'tzad kaisa shachaveri. A person shouldn't. 1 second. A person shouldn't urinate next to his friend's property unless he moved 3 tefachim away. It refers to emptying a chamber pot. Toshma lo yashna adamayim b'tzad koisa shachaveri. Elim ken herchim menu gimel tfachim. This is very clear. The Brisa specifically says you cannot urinate unless you move 3 tfachim. But when it's true because levanim, this is like a brittle lime. I will because avonim, but if it's a wall of avonim is hun rock. So this is like brick masonry. These are rocks that are sized. So then it's as long as it doesn't damage. It's less than 3 tefachim. V'kama tefach. It's 1 tefach. V'shal tsumma is raw rock. So this is like rocks that are pulled from the ground. You know, if anyone's been upstate New York, they have these. You go to the bungalow colonies. They have all these walls that were built out of untouched rock. They built 150 years ago, and they're still there. Okay, mutter, it's permitted. Then it won't get damaged by a person urinating against it. Tiyufta Rabbi Chana tiyufta. This clearly undermines the opinion of Rabbi Chana. Rabbi Chana says it's permitted to urinate against a wall, and this Brisa says clearly it's prohibited to. So Gemara says, but Rabbi Chana brought a verse to support him. He has a good argument. The verse seems to call a male a mashtan bekir, somebody who urinates against a wall. It seems to be otherwise permitted. So the Gemara says, I feel immediately even the thing that urinates against the wall will not be left alive from the family of Achav. What is that thing? Kalba, it's a dog. Meaning not only the males of the entire family will be wiped out, including the dogs. The dogs of Achav will also die. Okay. The next discussion is a total tangent. 2 minutes. I'll just sort of introduce it. It's really quite a distance from this Masechta. There's multiple types of tumah. One of the types of tumah is a tumah of a dead body. It creates a tumah called tumas oil. That means the entire structure of the house is tameh. Now, let's say you have a house with multiple rooms. So if we presume the tumah travels toward the exit, because the body is going to be removed from the house. So if let's say you have a house, and in the house is a sealed room, and in that sealed room is a dead body. Don't ask me what happened. It was a dungeon. Who knows what happened? Okay, the guy died, and now he's in a sealed room. What happens? There's tumah now coming out of the house in every direction, because the body's going to have to leave. We don't know how it's going to leave. It's going to leave from a window, even if the window is just this big. This big, anything in the windowsill is tummy, because we don't know how it's going to leave. Let's say the house is a front entrance, and the body is in that front entrance, and then the inner rooms, right? So the front entrance is open to the door to get out of the house. All the other rooms are locked. There's no tumah in the other rooms. Why? Because we know it's getting out. It's getting out through the open front door. All the other rooms are locked. There's no tumah. If there's direct route of the tumah to exit, then we presume that everything else is tahar. Now, we said the window has to be this big. What happens if the window is smaller? Then there would be no tumah in the window. If the window is just a narrow slit, there's no tumah. Now, here's the question. The question is, how do I fill the window to make it very narrow? Okay. Stop there, and that's the discussion. How we fill the window is a discussion.